Right now you're conscious, whatever else you can doubt, you cannot doubt this. But where did this consciousness come from? And more importantly, where will it go? Common sense seems to tell us that it comes from the brain, and when we die, it goes away along with our brain. But that's not what the Buddha taught. He said in meditation upon his awakening, he saw infinite past lives. But how is that possible if neuroscience seems to tell us that consciousness is made from the brain? Well, it's not so simple. As the Buddhist philosopher Dharmakirti argued, consciousness can only come from consciousness itself. If that is the case, consciousness would have existed before our birth and will continue past our death. In this video, we will explore Dharmakirti's argument for rebirth, which belongs to a genre of arguments known as the paralokicity, or the demonstration of other worlds. What about neuroscience then? Doesn't it tell us brains produce consciousness? Well, no, it only makes observations between the correlation of brain states and the testimonies of people with experiences, their behaviors, and their reactions to stimuli. So, it doesn't demonstrate a causal relationship, it only observes a correlation between these two things. In that way, the question of the origin of consciousness is still open discussion. And that is where Dharmakirti steps in and lets us know that consciousness can only produce itself. It can never come from matter. So to understand why Dharmakirti thought matter can't produce consciousness, we need to look at these fundamental principles of Buddhism. These three principles are the Chariot Principle, the Cluster Principle, and the Continuity Principle. We draw these ideas from Abhidharma, or the rational discipline of exploring Buddhist thought. Let's begin with the Chariot Principle. Imagine we're riding in a chariot. Now where is this chariot? Is it in its wheels? No. The axles? Also no. Its seat? Well, definitely not. It isn't hiding in its parts, nor is it separate from them. It's nothing over and above its components. It's merely a concept used to group together some related objects. The chariot is what Buddhism refers to as a composite, something made of parts. So what does that tell us about things in the world? It tells us that composite things are just labels. This leaves only the simplest possible parts as a real existence. These basic parts must possess no more than a single characteristic, or face the danger of deconstruction as the chariot did. These are the basic building blocks of the world, the Lego pieces everything is made of. Examples of these Lego blocks would be characteristics like shape or hardness. These are things that if divided and reduced further would become total nothingness. We can't reduce shape any further and say it's made of shapeless components. That's saying things without shape, meaning things without spatial extension can create spatial extension. That would be like piling empty space on top of more empty space and expecting to create a building. These basic Lego blocks are referred to as dharmas in Buddhism. Why does this matter to rebirth? Well, soon we will find that consciousness is one of these Lego dharmas. If that's the case, then attempts to reduce mind further to matter face a serious problem. Moving to the cluster principle, now we ask ourselves, can these basic building blocks of the universe exist by themselves? Can we think of a shape that has no color, or a color without shape? Well, of course not. Let's take color for example. When we think of blue or red, it always comes in an organized shape like a square or a triangle, or an amorphous blob, but again, that's still a shape. So what this tells us is no dharma or basic unit of existence can arise by itself. It must always be supported by a multitude of conditions. And here we can infer another kind of non-conceptual existence, something that has multiple characteristics but can never be separated from any of them. So if any characteristic of it were taken away, like shape taken away from color or color taken away from shape, everything would collapse like a house of cards. This is not like the chariot or some other kind of complex composite existence, because if you take away the wheel of a chariot or take away an axle, there's still something left. It doesn't just vanish out of existence, unlike when you take away color from shape or shape from color. So is consciousness a basic building block of the universe? Well, let's find out. Consciousness is that which gives us the knowledge of what it's like to be something. So let's say we have the experience of an apple. Then this consciousness of the apple has two aspects. There is the apple as we experience it, and our self-awareness of that experience. Neither of these two things can be separated from the other. Without the apple of experience, there is nothing to be self-aware of. And without self-awareness, we can never know of that experienced apple. Either case, if one of them were to be taken away, we would be left with nothing at all. So that leaves consciousness as a basic building block of the universe that cannot be reduced any further into its parts. Finally, we can now establish the rebirth of consciousness with this final principle, the continuity principle. So having already seen that the only real existence in the world are dharmas with a single feature, we also have to conclude that they have no temporal extension at all. That is, they only exist for a single moment of time. And why is that the case? Well, if it did last through multiple periods of time, then that dharma would have an additional characteristic of temporal extension. Let's talk about the dharma shape. So if shape lasted over time, it will both have its own characteristic, that is shape, and also the second characteristic of temporal extension, meaning it is no longer a simple and basic dharma, but a composite like a chariot that has multiple features, rendering it into a non-real existent. So dharmas, therefore, have no temporal extension at all. They suddenly arise and cease in the same instant. They can't arise slowly, nor can they disappear over time. Well, why does that matter? This is important because it tells us how consciousness is able to perpetuate itself. That is because while dharmas only last a second, they don't just disappear but exist in a continuity. They are always succeeded by more dharmas of the same kind, like when one candle lights another. The first candle flame produces a second similar but different flame in another candle. Dharmas of the same class are responsible for their own production. That means dharmas always produce similar dharmas in succeeding moments without ending in an infinite domino chain. If they didn't continuously produce themselves, they would either be completely different every second or just stop existing after a single moment. You might see where this argument is going now. If consciousness is really a dharma, then moments of consciousness cannot come from the brain. It can only arise from other moments of consciousness. That is not to say the brain isn't a supporting condition for the existence of consciousness. Further, it can't be the case that dharmas like consciousness will totally cease at some point. Since dharmas are not made of any further simpler building blocks, their extinction will be permanent, because there will be nothing more to build them out of. If they could extinguish, the world would have long since ceased existing when its most basic building blocks blinked out of existence, one after the other. Thus, consciousness must flow on in this momentary continuity, arising and ceasing without end. We've established the continuity of consciousness under the condition that it's a dharma, but have we totally ruled out that the brain could be its producer? Let's look back at the Chariot Principle now. So far we've argued that consciousness is a basic building block of the universe. But what if it weren't? What if it was just a composite the brain built out of matter, like a house or a car? Well, in that case, the Chariot Principle tells us that the consciousness would be nothing but a label, a designation of other parts, and all its features and functions would originate from those parts. It would have no capacity to do anything at all without those parts, so it is really those parts that possess consciousness and self-awareness, which are the features of consciousness, right? Consciousness is what it's like to be something, and the self-awareness of that knowledge. It's the aroma of coffee, it's the redness of an apple, and it's the experience of building a house out of Lego blocks. Do these sound like characteristics material elements could have? Should consciousness be made of material parts? It would mean those material parts themselves have self-awareness. They have the knowledge of what it's like to be something. We would end up saying that chairs and tables are as self-aware and sentient as we are. So it will appear that the material elements lack the necessary features to be considered the building blocks of consciousness. Some philosophers, however, bite the bullet and say everything is conscious. These are the panpsychists. They say every Lego block, every electron, anything that is material at all, bears consciousness. This view is rejected by Dharmakirtian logic. Suppose every Lego block was conscious. Where do these tiny minds go when you build a Lego brick house? Does your experience contain millions of tinier consciousnesses? No. Our conscious experience exists just as it appears. When we experience an apple, we have a singular, indivisible awareness of it. Experience is transparent, and looking through it, there aren't a million little awarenesses making up tiny parts of that apple experience. Experience is an inseparable unity, not a composite of little parts. So, panpsychism, like the regular materialist view, doesn't hold up. But what if matter isn't conscious, yet it had the potential to generate consciousness? For example, water is wet, but individual water molecules are not. When they gather together, they generate wetness. Can't consciousness and matter work in the same way? Well, it could, if we could infer that consciousness were to be produced from matter. When we look at individual molecules, we can infer that from the interaction of mass, size, and shape, that it will produce wetness when it's gathered together. The nature of water is such that we can tell that it will be wet when its molecules come together. Now, let's picture something else. A pink elephant suddenly appeared on my empty desk, and you asked, how did that elephant get there? But I just say, well, elephants are produced from desks, aren't they? How? They just are. That's not very helpful, is it? This is a case of brute emergence, where the relationship between a cause and effect is arbitrary, meaning anything could be the cause of anything else. You cannot infer that the effect will come from the cause just by investigating the cause itself. In this way, there's no inferable principle from which consciousness is produced from matter. No matter how much we poke and prod at inanimate matter, we cannot discover a principle by which consciousness could be produced. In this way, there is no inferable principle from which consciousness would be produced from matter. We could poke at matter as much as we want, investigate all its electrons, all its atoms, anything that is material at all, and we could never infer a principle from which consciousness is produced within. With that, we finally gathered up all the building blocks of Dharmakirti's argument. If consciousness cannot be explained from matter, then it must have another source, and that source is a previous moment of consciousness. If each instance of consciousness always needs a previous moment of consciousness as its cause, then our first moment of awareness in this life cannot have been the beginning to our mind. It must have had a previous conscious cause from a previous life. And likewise, going the other way, our final moment of consciousness before death is not the end. It is merely the cause for the first instance of consciousness in the next life. This is what the Buddha called rebirth. We started the video with a question: where did consciousness come from, and where will it go? Dharmakirti's answer is that it always comes from a previous moment of consciousness, and will go on ever forwards to produce further instances of consciousness. Through this investigation, we found that rebirth isn't just a fanciful religious belief. It follows from the nature of the world itself. I hope this helps you sort through why Buddhists believe in rebirth, and if you're interested in further arguments that reconstruct Dharmakirti's view on rebirth, this video is heavily indebted to Dr. Jacob Lucas's doctrinal thesis, Mindful Life or Mindful Lives. I highly recommend reading it. And if you're interested in Buddhist philosophy, please don't hesitate to like and subscribe, then drop a comment on if you think Dharmakirti is right or not.